Hello, let me introduce you the Peter Pan syndrome. So this syndrome refers to J. Matthew Barrie's tale. This tale tells the story of Peter Pan, an eggless boy who doesn't want to grow up and prefers to live in the world of childhood forever. This syndrome was invented by the psychoanalyst Dan Quillay in 1983, who wrote a book, The Peter Pan Syndrome: Those Men Who Refused to Grow Up. Those who develop this syndrome are children who are anxious by the idea of growing up and who are unable to face their responsibilities. We could say that these people are children in adult bodies. As conceptualized by the American psychologist, the Peter Pan syndrome would only concern men. But other psychologists have pointed out that Dan Quillay was wrong. Women too may have this syndrome. This syndrome has never been recognized as a mental illness or as a clinical entity. It's why it is not included in the DSM-4, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This desire not to grow up and this desire to make a childhood last can be explained by the absence of a key stage in the development of every human being. Indeed, instead of normally going through the different psychological and physiological stages between childhood and adulthood, with with Peter Pan syndrome seems not to experience adolescence. However, Peter Pan's complex has nothing to do with intelligence but rather with emotions. The psychologist Jean Flamand explains that children separate their intellect from their emotions to protect themselves. The intellect evolves with its new responsibilities, but the emotions remain blocked in childhood. He wrote that this is why these people who are very sharp and perceptive when it comes to intellect will be able to show impulsive and childish reaction when it comes to emotions. So now I'm gonna talk about the causes. So there are several causes for this syndrome who starts in childhood. They are all more or less due to an emotional trauma. We have, for example, the lack of love, growing up with an alcoholic or absent father, being confronted with death, having a parent who is difficult to please. Also, if the father is passive at home or does not get involved in family's life and is criticized by the mother. The overprotection of parents is another factor. According to a study by the University of Granada in 2007, Ambelin Grubel Ortega, a professor of personality and psychology, said that it has been shown that it concerns dependent people who have been overprotected by their families and have not developed the necessary skills to cope with an adult life. There are also sometimes children who have to take on heavy responsibilities at a very early age, such as taking on the role of father in the family. The child is torn between being a child and taking on new adult responsibilities. The child may have to take on some domestic chores and look after his younger brothers or sister, for example. There is also the obligation to start an artistic career or have a professional obligation at an early age. There are also external sociological and economic factors. So in Les Adolescentes, um, writing by social psychiatrist Tony Anatrilla, who also adds the role of society in the Peter Pan syndrome. He says that society maintains immaturity particularly through education, which is increasingly focused on emotional well-being to the detriment of reality, which often gives people personalities that are certainly plastic and sympathetic, but also sometimes superficial, even if insignificant, and who do not always have a sense of limits. Also, from about 20 years ago, the adolescence can extend into the 20s and even 30s. In 2000, the psychologist Jeffrey Arnett invented the term emerging adulthood to describe these adolescents. Moreover, according to the latest INSEE figures, 46% of 19 to 29 years old still lives with their parents, a rate of 80% in Spain, one of the countries most affected by the crisis.
We know that the Peter Pan syndrome has an impact on a person's relationship and quality of life. But to avoid this, you have to be able to make a diagnosis first, which means that we must take into account a number of symptoms. It was an American psychanalyst, Dan Kinley, who popularized this syndrome. He published a book in 1983 in which he lists all the symptoms that he has established in the research. According to Kinley, 6 psychological traits dominate the life of a patient with Peter Pan syndrome. They are present at every stage and are noticed mainly in times of crisis. When the patient settles into the chronic phase of the syndrome, he tends to hide behind a mask of maturity. The first sign is emotional paralysis. The patient does not express his emotion as he feels them. They often emerge in extreme forms, for example, anger in the form of rage, joy in that of hysteria, and disappointment in that of self-pity. In the second stage is the procrastination. In stage 1 of Peter Pan syndrome, young patients keep putting things off until they are forced to do it. Older patients feeling guilty about losing their youth become hyperactive. According to Kinley, this could be explained the fact that they do not know how to relax. The social importance. The patient with Peter Pan syndrome have great difficulty making true friends. Their impulse modify their notion of good and evil. Their priority is to seek out friends and be friendly at the expense of their families. The magical thinking. Patients have recourse to magical truth. It's order not to admit their faults. Completely intellectual evasion such as anyway I'm right because otherwise this can only be fault of further, which allow them to protect themselves from any attack. This often leads them to abuse drugs, believing that can make their problems disappear under the effect of the latter. We also encounter problems with the mother and father, and the last stage is conflict over sex. The patient receives external sexuality as violent, abject, and dirty acts. The psychological impact of the sex on the person is not negligible because the individual can become asexual in adulthood. To illustrate of the symptom, we can take the example of the case of Michael Jackson suffering from this syndrome. He said he had no childhood, which he described his songs of the same name, so he collected the toy and even had a gigantic amusement park like he called Neverland Ranch.
So now I'm going to talk to you about how to cure this syndrome. First of all, I think the first thing that we need to have in mind when we talk about treatments in general, I think is that, of course, everybody is different, and so not everybody will react the same way to the same treatments, and so everything that I'm going to tell you next needs to, of course, be adapted to every patient. So there is two main steps into the process of healing this disease. The first one being, first you need to understand that this patient lives in his own world, in his own realities. And so the therapist's work is to slowly invite the patient into the real world, to teach him how it works, how to deal with it, to teach him that as an adult in this world, he has responsibilities. And when I say slowly, it's because you need to go step by step, because of course this patient has lived his whole life thinking that his fantasy world is the real world. So progressively, thanks to the work he's going to do with the therapist, the adult inside of the patient will take over and will be like a guide to the children he has inside of him, to help him overcome his fears, to help him face his responsibilities and everything. The second step is, of course, to have a nice environment, to be surrounded by people that love you, that understand you, that support you. Because in this syndrome in particular, you have a child inside of you, a child that is afraid, that is constantly scared of the outside world and the responsibilities and the idea of being an adult. So in this syndrome in particular, you need to be surrounded by people, because alone the children cannot fix himself. Secondly, therapists have noticed that to truly recover from this syndrome, you need to fix any kind of issue you have with your parents. Because, of course, our parents are the people that not teach us how to live, but teach us how to act as an adult in the society. Like, through the years, they will teach us how to live alone, how to pay bills, how to go do groceries, and every kind of small responsibilities that you have as an adult. So if the patient is not in good terms with his parents, or still have some profound and unconscious issues with his parents, he cannot be fixed. He cannot recover from this syndrome. So communication, like in a lot of mental disease, communication is the key for a great recovery.